So today we're answering the question, is looking at your hands hurting your piano playing progress? We'll cover why you shouldn't look at your hands, the key skill that you need to build and how to do it, and if you're wondering, but I always see pianists in concert looking at their hands, then we're going to cover the why and how to do that as well. So why shouldn't you look at your hands? Well, the first reason is that it's often unnecessary and it's likely distracting you from something else that you could be doing. Whenever we need to look at the music and we need to look at our hands, that's when we end up in a bit of a tricky situation. This often leads to memorizing a section or part of the music only to look up again and find out we don't know where we are on the page, and that's where we halt or disrupt the flow of the music. Memorizing music is really important and I fully encourage it, but I'd also recommend that you get your music flowing and moving fluently while reading first. This all comes down to one key technique that seems almost magical. It's the ability to map the keyboard in your head so that you no longer have to look at the keys. Playing the piano essentially comes down to measuring distances, and we want to learn to do this as much as possible without looking. The way to achieve this is through feeling our way around the piano instead of looking. It's about developing this sense of spatial awareness and the muscle memory for the distances that you measure. The more that you play, the more that you'll be able to play just by touch alone. We'll explore specific exercises to develop this mental mapping in just a moment, but here's why you should look at your hands. The first reason is to learn. A big part of the learning process is to see what your hand needs to do and then to measure that distance. So you can do this with intervals. If we took an interval of an octave, even without looking, I know that approximately an octave will feel like that in my hand. It's really about how the intervals feel as you play them. So if we find an octave on the piano, we just know that that distance is an octave. But say you didn't know what an octave was yet, then how do we learn that? So here are the points that I'd use to learn this distance. So first, I'd take the octave and I'd look at the distance in my hand. Then I'd repeat that without looking and see how does it actually feel under the hand. And then I'd repeat that, but I'd take it into a scale. So I'd look at my hand and play a scale. And then I'd repeat the scale without looking. So this is essentially what we're doing, just on a bigger scale in our pieces. So if I wanted to measure this jump in this Chopin, but I didn't want to look at it, then you could try that jump while looking a few times, and then try and repeat the jump without looking. And then try and insert it into the piece. So the second reason that you should look at your hands is to see how you're playing and improve on it. Is the angle of your wrist right? How relaxed are your elbows? Is the movement smooth, which will make it easier for us to memorize? You'll be able to see if you're being efficient with your movements and really moving them slowly and smoothly. What I mean by smoothly is not in a kind of jumpy fashion. The smooth movement is where we slowly move between them and measure the distance between the notes. If it's loose and we try and measure a distance, we're not going to be able to remember it. It's this slow practice then that helps us to memorize these distances between the notes. The final reason that you should look at your hands is to do with memorization. It's about the visual feedback that you get from the keys and how this ties in with what you feel. It's the patterns and the notes and the chords that you see being pressed down that you can remember. Now, we won't jump into memory too deeply here, but it does depend on various factors, and this visual feedback is certainly one of them. Before we jump into the next point about when and how to look at your hands, if you feel as though your piano practice could do with more structure and you'd like to know exactly what to cover in a practice session, then download the 60-minute practice routine from the link in the description that I've been using for years. It's complete with loads of book recommendations, and it should help you to know exactly what to do when you sit at the piano. So when and how should you look at your hands? Well, I suppose this really depends on whether you've memorized your music or whether you're using the score, because the answer is going to be very different for both of them. If you have memorized your music like you would do for a performance, then looking at the keys can almost certainly be beneficial because you're getting this visual feedback and it's forming part of the memory. Practicing without looking, though, is absolutely important. Firstly, you will develop this mental map of the keyboard, and secondly, you'll be relying on other forms of memory because you won't be relying on the visual cues. A question that comes up a lot is when and how should you look at your hands if you're reading the music? We talked about the importance of looking at our hands during the learning process, but as a general rule, we want to look at our hands as little as possible, and if possible, not at all. In reality, there are always going to be places where we need to look. For instance, when we have jumps. Even if we can complete the jump, like earlier, without looking at our hands, it would just be safer to do so. So at that point, how do we look at the score and then come back to it when we've got a jump? So this is where the glance comes in, and it's just a quick and efficient look to almost confirm where you already know that you need to go. So for instance, in our Chopin, we're going to just really quickly glance at the F that we need to jump to, and then our eyes go straight back to the score. Okay, so what if you have a series of consecutive jumps? Well, this is when you really need to memorize the music that you're playing. But one of the things that we talked about earlier was getting lost in the score when you come back to it. And that's when you need to do a little bit of forward planning. You need to know, after you've completed that section, exactly where you're going to be on the score when you look up again. The same sort of thing happens when you've got a page turn. If you have a page turn, you need to plan when you're going to turn the page. And in this Chopin, it's actually really convenient because I've got these rests in the right hand when I can use my right hand to turn the page. But that's not always the case. Often there isn't a good point to turn at the page turn, so we need to find somewhere in the right hand or in the left hand where we can turn the page, but we'll need to memorize that section. So having memorized that section, turn the page, we need to know where we're going to look once we've turned it. We know why, when, and how to look at our hands, but we really need to develop this mental mapping of the keyboard. So here are 3 strategies to do just that. Here's the first and perhaps the most important, and it's to memorize the scales and the patterns that we use on the piano all of the time. These are the distances that you are going to measure, especially in arpeggios. These really help you to get around the keyboard, constantly measuring the different distances. The second strategy I call look, feel, learn, and it's about taking the section of music that you're playing, looking through it, looking at your hands as you play smoothly and slowly, feeling your way around that section, and then trying to repeat that but without looking. The third strategy is just about actively practicing the skill. So in this case, we are trying to improve our mental mapping. So it's about thinking about this in everything that you do. Now, as we talk about this a lot, you can't think about absolutely everything at once. So just take each week at a time, focusing on one different skill. Every week we talk about a new skill, so take that skill for the week and try and just develop that one. Be conscious in everything that you're playing of improving that one skill. Playing without looking will change how you play the piano, but it won't change how your music sounds. So to do that, check out this next video about the piano pedal. We learn the pedal rules and then we break them. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next one.